Welcome everybody to our talk. And let's maybe begin with a bit of etymology first. Apocalypse, coming from the Greek apocalypsis, means revelation. And with that little word, we actually already demarcate every apocalyptic narrative that we have, whether it's literature or film or video games, of course, as a narrative of dichotomy. There's always that which is revealed, which is the great cataclysm, the end of the world, but also that sort of potential future coming after that blank slate state. And there is the one to whom this revelation is made, the one going through the apocalyptic events and looking into the future with either despair or hope. Quite often it's a group of survivors, but in many iterations, especially in video games, this also can boil down to the role of a sole survivor. And this is where we might need some tech support to get you.
This is Dr. Catherine Collins. I don't know if anyone will ever hear this. It's all over. I'm the only one left.
So as Natalie rightfully said, this is not my first frog rodeo. I'm a longtime frogger. And every time I'm here, apparently I have to speak about Everybody's Gone to the Rapture. That topic is just not leaving me. And I mean, it's great. It's a beautiful game. We should talk about it way more often. And for a conference topic like this, of course, it has to play a role in it. Because in Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, we immerse ourselves in a virtual world via the first-person perspective that may or may not be Dr. Catherine Collins. Slight spoiler alerts here. So that would be the one side of the dichotomy, and the other one would be that very beautiful pastoral afterlife depiction of an apocalypse that we experience by traversing through it. And that space is what we're going to talk about today, actually. Space is the cohesive in the dichotomy of the apocalypse, and we are going to explore these spaces in various dimensions. We will be doing so by first and foremost delving a bit more in the idea of the apocalyptic dichotomy before going on talking about various dimensions of apocalyptic scales. I will be introducing the ideas of the local apocalypse and the global apocalypse to you before Tim is then taking over to speak about the liminal apocalypse, about mirrored spaces, and of course, we hopefully can draw some conclusions from all of that chaos that lies ahead of us. So, the motive of dichotomy is really important to understand what an apocalypse is all about, actually. From a psychological perspective, and following Mauricio Cortina here, we can say that every time a human being is confronted with impending doom or something that we might sense would live up to apocalyptic proportions, it would determinate us to follow into a line of either going into a mode of despair or a mode of hope and act accordingly. It's actually sad enough that at a conference like this, we have to refer to current state of affairs and newspaper events quite regularly, actually. But open your newspaper and you know what I'm talking about. There's a lot of people right now who see this impending doom coming, and their rhetorics, their speech/hate speech quite often either falls into one of these two dimensions. Quite interestingly, though, a dichotomy is also something that kind of arranges how us human beings create our own identities and represent themselves or represent ourselves to the outside. If we follow Catherine Woodward, we can actually say that every item or marker of identity that we have with us either falls into the categories of the sacred or the profane, meaning in the sense of the profane, that there's a magnitude of items all around us that we just take as ordinary artifacts of everyday concrete reality and existence. But some among them are special to us because they speak to us on a cognitive level, on an emotional level. They help us to figure out who we are. They help us to signal to others who we are or who we want to be. That would be the sacred of it. And for us, it's always about figuring out what is the great mass of profanity and what is the sacred among that. Yep, just think about your favorite t-shirt that you have in a closet full of clothes that you kind of need to have because you have to look proper for going to your job in the morning and stuff like that. But also think about political beliefs, which you might uphold for yourself, but which you also see in others, which you can then discuss about, be in conflict about, and so on and so forth. Now, adapting this to the video game as a spatial medium again basically means that once we inhibit this virtual space via the incorporation of the player avatar compound, we are in a realm of environmental storytelling clues, which could be sacred, which could be profane, which could lead us to a state of desperation or hope. Quite often in the apocalyptic video game, it's the great world state of despair. Within that, we have one main quest line that is supposed to lead us and the rest of humanity and humankind to a state of hope again. And we have to figure out what is important to us and why. So in the end of the day, if we talk about the apocalypse, we talk about ta-da, I said the title, the scales of apocalypse. So our train of thought for that one would be as follows. If we talk about the apocalyptic video games, we talk about the worldview that we have in these games. We talk about how we are thrown into a video game world and how we then perceive the apocalyptic state of affairs from the perspective of an avatar, a group of avatars, and so on and so forth. This worldview would then, of course, also be defined by the virtual geography of a video game. Its dimensions, its size, its proportions, the things that we are allowed to do in this environment via agency, the things we may not be allowed to do, but only are allowed to witness. Virtual geography is then furthermore defined by its rhythm, which we can discuss along Kirkpatrick. And the basic idea here would be that a video game is not just only a space, but it's a space that's ordered in a very specific temporal structure. There's a beat to it, there's a rhythm to it. There are video games that are very slow-paced, video games that are fast-paced, video games that are basically repeating a couple of principles and ideas over and over again. Sometimes with the surprising spike in tension in between to just hold on to us. Think about survival horror games, for example, which are typically tense but rather slow-paced. You have to solve puzzles, you have to sneak around, but once the monster shows up, we are up there again in a sort of break with the rhythm of the game, which allows us then to say that the rhythm of a video game shapes affect. Every sort of emotional connection we have to what's going on in a video game, to our avatar, to the surroundings of our avatar, to the narrative, to its aesthetics, that's coming from us being in that spatiotemporal vortex of, oh my God, this is getting complicated, isn't it?
No, you're doing fine.
Thank you, thank you. But yeah, we're all in that middle of it. And therefore, of course, we can finally say that affect, the things that we feel and experience in a video game, shape how we experience the magnitude of an apocalypse that it's presenting to us, which is now finally taking us to the scales that I've been promising you. We start at a local, and I promise you, after this one, I'm going to shut up about Everybody's Gone to the Rapture. Unless you want to talk more about it in the break, of course, that's what I'm here for. Just let me know. Everybody's Gone to the Rapture is just a wonderful example here because it has a very secluded, almost safe, cozy space in which the apocalypse takes place. We are in a deserted village somewhere between Wales and England. Everybody has gone to the Rapture, of course, everybody but us. So we are free to traverse this space, which Dan Pinchback, the lead developer behind the game, fittingly described as a space of little apocalypses. So it's not the grand apocalypse, it's not the grandeur that we are witnessing, but we are actually able to find glowing orbs that are remnants of the people who have lived in that village. And every little remnant kind of tells us a bit about their backstory, about things that have happened to them before the grand apocalypse happened. And by collecting these little sacred items, these little orbs, we come to the conclusion that, of course, the rapture has been a dramatic event in the game, but not every rapture has to kind of lead to an ultimate doom outcome. There's actually some very bittersweet sorrowness and hope to that one. On the other hand, as an example for a local apocalypse, we have a game called Spiritfarer, which is maybe not a apocalyptic game per se. It's not really like branding itself as a post-APOC or APOC game. However, we are having a little houseboat. We are on a vast ocean and we are collecting dead souls to give them some sort of safety and lead them to the afterlife. So if we think about that one, it's actually pretty apocalyptic per se. However, just like Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, this is really a very cozy approach due to the limited space that we have when it comes to the apocalypse. We have our shelter, we have our houseboat, that's the most we see throughout the entirety of the game. We can make it more beautiful, we can build little rooms on it, we use these rooms to shelter these ghosts, we can talk to them, we can check in how they feel, and literally just care for them in the safe space that we provide to make sure that they arrive safely in the afterlife. Global apocalypses then is something that we quite often find in AAA sandbox games that deal with apocalyptic topics. Of course, I could not talk about this without talking about the Fallout games, but we also have many other franchises nowadays that kind of fall into similar directions, such as the Horizon Zero Dawn games. In the sandbox games, we of course have a much bigger space. There's much more exploration to do. There's much more items that we can find. And therefore, all of a sudden, we approach that stage of liminality where a shift between the sacred and the profane can occur. So in Fallout 3, for example, I don't know how many of you have played that. quite early in the game, you stumble upon an abandoned house and you can find the skeletons of the people in there who didn't make it through the apocalypse, and it's really touching. That's like a very impactful moment. Then you find a second house, then third one. Then you find a notebook and an audio recording and more and more and more. And it's amassing to such a degree that all of a sudden that which appeared to be sacred in the beginning becomes more and more profane, because this is the desperate reality of that future. And so all of a sudden it's up to us as players to figure out what is really meaningful to us in this huge scatter amount of ruins, of notebooks, of audio files, of side quests, of NPCs, and what is actually, just sideline decoration in order to emphasize that apocalypticness of the game. So we've come from the local to the global, and now imagine what could happen if we go trans-franchise. If we start in one game, but the apocalypse doesn't really occur until the next one.
Yeah, so I will be explaining some more about the liminal spaces that Felix just mentioned. But before we can really dive into this, I would quickly like to go back to the idea of affect, and specifically Massumi's idea of affect through movement. And I have a little bit of an example here. In basic essence, the idea of movement and affect from Massumi comes from affect is generated in the movement between states, and the affect generates emotions. This is very simplified due to time. But as an example, I've put a few health bars on screen. Now, if you just look at them, they don't really mean anything. But imagine you're playing a game and your health, like this, the health bar goes low. And I think as we have all played games before, this kind of makes you a little bit nervous. So that's where kind of the emotions come from. It's the shifting in between states. To maybe exemplify this a little bit more, let's say you take a really big hit and your health goes really low, then you're even more nervous, maybe even fully panicked. And it's this idea of movement and generating emotions that I want to talk about a little bit more, and specifically, how does this relate to the apocalypse? Now, to have an apocalypse, we kind of need to have a before and after, and this idea of going from before the apocalypse to after the apocalypse is what I want to talk about. So, to give an example, The Last of Us, for those of you who are not familiar with the game, starts out with an introduction where you see a father and a daughter living their normal lives, and then slowly over the introduction, you see as the apocalypse starts to unfold around them. And this opening is really impactful because it shows how the world is changing around them, and it creates emotions inside of the player. This is very different to a game where you're already in the apocalypse and you're kind of, this is the status quo. It's this changing of the states that generates a lot of emotions. Now, this is only a very small part in The Last of Us. It's only the opening. What would happen if we make this into a full game or even game franchise? So this is where I would like to introduce the game that I'm going to be talking about, which is Muv-Luv, which was created by Age in 2003 and released in Japan. It basically starts out, it's a visual novel that starts out as a romantic comedy in like slice of life, high school setting, that then in the second game kind of pulls the rug out of under the player and reveals, oh, there is a second game where it takes a genre shift where we're in a, due to parallel dimension shenanigans, which I don't have time to go into, are transformed into a world that has been invaded by aliens, and the world is on the humanity is on the brinks of collapse. And this then finally wraps up in the last game where we basically get thrown into the world and see how the humanity deals with it, both on a personal level, a society level, etc., etc. So what we basically get here is that the model that Felix already talked about, where we have the pre, where we are in the normal, in the before. Then we have kind of this local apocalypse in the second game where we're kind of getting introduced to the world. It's all set in the same location with the same characters. And then we have the post where we're in the full apocalyptic, where we can see how this world really has changed and how we have changed as a species. And it's again this movement from these games where we go through all of these different settings that really create and impact us as a player and both the characters inside of the game. It's this transition. Which makes it really interesting. And this is where that idea of the mirrored spaces comes from, because we have this pre where we get introduced to this location, we start making bonds with these characters, both as a character, as a player, and then that's completely mirrored when we're thrown into this Milleristic setting and these same characters and the same settings are used. And this is where I basically want to draw this mirror line, because it's still connected to us in the personal, but it's mirrored, like we're the peace and quiet mirrored to the apocalyptic way of showcasing it. And this is really where that framework is established in this local apocalypse, in this personal. And this is where this profane, where, for example, like the basic stuff of, oh, I'm studying for an exam, I'm having lunch with friends, I think that's all very mundane stuff for us. But that really becomes sacred in a post-apocalyptic setting where you have to really treasure these brief moments, and it really exemplifies to the player what is sacred to them. This contractively goes along with the despair aspect as well. In this world, there's a lot of despair, and how are we going to deal with this? This kind of becomes profane in its own sense. When you're constantly worried about your life every day, it becomes the mundane. But since we have experienced this before, we have experienced as a player this normalcy, we also have the hope to, will the story go back to this, and the hope of seeing the world return to normal. And that's, I think, where these mirrored spaces really are special. It's basically allows us to directly confront the player with what they think is like sacred to them, what is profane to them, hope and despair, because we have this movement from the before to the after. And since we've seen both sides of it, and it is a mirrored space, we can kind of go both ways. We can directly question the player with these things. For example, in the game at one point, again, due to the time parallel universe shenanigans, the protagonist is transported from this apocalyptic setting back into the first setting, and kind of just doesn't know how to handle it. Like the two worlds completely collide. Like this, and you as a player as well, where you're standing, like you're made to question, what is sacred to me? What is profane to me? What is hope? What is despair? It kind of starts to fall apart because you don't know anymore. You're directly asked to think about these things. And I think this is where the idea of these apocalyptic games, and especially when you do these liminal spaces, can really make a player think.
Almost a picture-perfect ending. You never know what you've got until it's gone in the great apocalypse. The screen is black. So allow me to pull that time loop parallel dimension shenanigans card to rewind time and take us back for a short conclusion. So we as the player are stuck in that dichotomous state between despair and hope, between the sacred and the profane. And in order to kind of allocate what's really meaningful to us or not, we have to explore a space. The size of that space will then have an impact on how we are emotionally affected by the apocalypse that we are dealing with in that video game. Of course, there's countless examples that we could give and talk about, and I'm really happy to discuss more games with you guys in a later on coffee break. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.